The grand dining room of the luxurious five-star restaurant sparkled like a jewel box under crystal chandeliers. Laughter rippled across the tables, polished silverware clinked in rhythm, and the soft, measured notes of a live piano drifted gently in the background. It was a world of elegance and wealth. Men in tailored suits raised glasses of vintage wine. Women in shimmering gowns adjusted diamond earrings that glittered under the lights. Every gesture, every smile, every word carried a kind of practiced refinement. But in the midst of this glittering display of sophistication sat one woman who seemed to command attention without effort. She was alone at a corner table, her posture dignified, her gaze steady yet distant. Unlike the others, she did not dazzle with jewels or elaborate fashion. Instead, she wore a simple dark, kimono-style dress. It was understated, but on her it radiated quiet power. Her silver hair, neatly pinned, framed a face marked not only by age, but by decades of experience and wisdom. One hand rested on the table, trembling slightly, while the other clutched a small pendant against her chest as though it were a lifeline. The other guests noticed. Whispers spread like wildfire. "That's her, the Japanese businesswoman who built an empire in Tokyo." Some murmured she was in New York for investments, others speculated about her fortune. But admiration gave way to surprise when the waiter set a menu before her. Her eyes swept over the English words slowly, confusion flickering across her face. She tried to speak, her lips forming hesitant phrases in heavily accented English. The waiter leaned closer, repeating questions, raising his voice as if volume alone could close the gap. Still, the woman faltered. Around her, the atmosphere shifted. Guests glanced over, some smirking behind glasses of wine, others shaking their heads. Even the staff exchanged awkward looks, unsure how to handle the moment. A woman admired for her power and wealth was suddenly vulnerable, trapped in a world where her voice could not reach anyone. Beneath her composure, a glimmer of loneliness shone through. Loneliness no amount of money could erase. At a distance, a young waitress named Emily watched quietly. She was not part of the elite staff serving the VIPs. Her tasks were simple: clearing glasses, carrying water, refilling bread baskets. Her uniform was plain, her ponytail slightly messy from the evening rush. She blended into the background, and most nights, that was exactly how she wanted it. But tonight, something inside her stirred. As she watched the dignified woman struggle, Emily remembered her own grandmother. She had been Japanese too, living in America for decades but never fully mastering English. Emily, as a little girl, had often sat at her grandmother's kitchen table, listening, translating, bridging the gap when the world grew impatient. It had always felt like a quiet, hidden part of her identity, a skill rarely needed, almost forgotten. Until now. Emily hesitated. It wasn't her table. Her manager would disapprove if she intervened, but her heart pressed her forward. Gathering courage, she approached the table. The wealthy diners watched curiously as this young waitress, clearly out of place among the polished servers, leaned gently toward the woman and softly spoke, in Japanese. The transformation was instant. The older woman froze, disbelief flashing across her eyes. For a moment she seemed stunned, unsure whether to trust what she had heard. And then, when Emily repeated herself, the woman's lips parted and tears filled her eyes. Relief swept over her face like sunlight breaking through clouds. She smiled, softly at first, then more fully, as words poured from her in fluent, graceful Japanese. The entire dining room fell into silence. Diners who had moments earlier smirked now leaned forward, their expressions shifting from amusement to awe. Emily responded with ease, listening carefully, translating her meal preferences to the chef, and staying by her side whenever needed. The once isolated woman was suddenly laughing gently, her dignity restored by the smallest of gestures. That night it was not diamonds, not tailored suits, not wealth that commanded the room. It was kindness, the quiet compassion of a young waitress who remembered the voice of her grandmother had changed everything. When the meal ended, the woman reached across the table and held Emily's hand. Her grip was surprisingly strong, her eyes shimmering with gratitude. She whispered words in Japanese, words of thanks that went far beyond simple politeness. Emily nodded, her own throat tight with emotion. Weeks later, Emily received a letter at the restaurant. Inside was a handwritten note in Japanese and an elegant invitation. The millionaire had requested her presence at a cultural foundation event in the city. But this time, Emily was invited not as staff, but as a guest of honor. Alongside the invitation was a scholarship offer. The woman had discovered that Emily was studying languages at community college, struggling to pay tuition. She wanted to sponsor her, to give her the future she deserved. Emily wept as she read the letter. She had never imagined that one small act of compassion could ripple so far. The woman had given her more than money. She had given her belief, proof that her heart and heritage were gifts worth honoring. Years later, Emily would stand on stages as a professional translator, traveling between countries, bridging cultures, and carrying with her the memory of that night. She often recalled the silence that fell over the glittering restaurant, the tears in the Japanese woman's eyes, and the powerful lesson revealed in that moment. Wealth may open doors, status may demand respect, but true connection, the kind that heals loneliness and restores dignity, comes only from kindness. And sometimes the smallest voice in the room can make the greatest difference. The grand dining room of the five-star restaurant glittered beneath chandeliers, filled with the music of laughter, silverware, and a live piano in the corner. Wealth and elegance were on full display, men in tailored suits, women in shimmering gowns, each movement polished and precise. Then she arrived, a Japanese businesswoman instantly recognized by many. Whispers spread from table to table. That's the woman who built an empire in Tokyo. She was powerful, admired, a millionaire whose reputation reached across oceans. She took her seat quietly in a corner, dressed not in diamonds or bold colors, but in a simple, dark kimono-style dress that spoke of dignity rather than fashion. Silver hair, neatly pinned, framed her face. Her presence alone commanded respect. But when the waiter placed the menu before her, admiration began to shift. She stared at the English words, her brow furrowing. She tried to order, but the phrases came halting, broken, heavy with accent. The waiter leaned closer, raising his voice, repeating questions. She shook her head gently, flustered. Around her, the air in the room changed. Guests began to smirk, some whispering to each other. Others sighed, rolling their eyes. The woman who had been greeted with awe was suddenly the subject of silent mockery. Her wealth and influence meant nothing here, in a place where language was power she did not possess. Her composure held, but beneath it, her hands trembled slightly as they clutched a small pendant at her chest. In her eyes was something far more human than fortune, loneliness. At the back of the room, Emily, a young waitress, noticed. She wasn't supposed to. It wasn't her table. Her job was to refill water, clear plates, and stay out of the spotlight. Her uniform was plain, her ponytail loose from the evening rush. Normally she faded into the background, but tonight, watching the woman's struggle, Emily's heart ached. She remembered her grandmother, who had lived in America for decades, yet never mastered English. As a child, Emily would sit beside her, listening to her stories in Japanese, helping translate. When neighbors or doctors grew impatient, it had been a quiet part of her life, almost hidden, something she carried inside but rarely used. Now she realized it might matter. Emily glanced at her manager, who was already frowning, whispering instructions to another waiter. She knew she would be scolded for interfering, but something stronger than fear pushed her forward. Slowly, she walked across the room toward the woman's table. The diners watched, curious. What was this young waitress, clearly out of place among the suited servers, going to do? Emily bent down slightly, looked into the woman's eyes with warmth, and softly spoke, in Japanese. The transformation was immediate. The woman's eyes widened, stunned. For a moment she seemed unable to breathe. And then, when Emily repeated herself, the woman's lips parted, her face breaking into relief. Tears welled in her eyes as words poured out of her in graceful Japanese. Emily responded smoothly, translating her requests to the kitchen and assuring her comfort. The restaurant fell silent. The same guests who had mocked now leaned forward, hushed. Respect replaced ridicule. The millionaire, once isolated and humiliated, was laughing softly, her dignity restored, not by wealth, but by the compassion of a young waitress who dared to remember her grandmother's voice. Emily stayed with her through the evening, translating whenever needed, offering kindness in small but meaningful gestures. By the end of the night, the woman reached for Emily's hand, holding it tightly. She whispered words of gratitude, words only Emily understood, her eyes shining with tears. But the story didn't end there. Weeks later, Emily received a letter at the restaurant. Inside was a handwritten note in Japanese, along with an elegant invitation. The woman wanted her to attend a cultural foundation event, not as staff, but as an honored guest. Attached was a scholarship offer. She had learned. Emily was studying languages, struggling to afford tuition. She wanted to support her education, to ensure her voice, the one that had reached her when no one else could, would continue to bridge worlds. Emily wept as she read the letter. She had thought her act of kindness was small, fleeting, but it had transformed her life. The woman had given her not just financial support, but belief, a validation that kindness, heritage, and compassion were gifts worth honoring. Years later, Emily would stand proudly as a professional translator, traveling across countries, bridging cultures, always remembering the night it began. A night when admiration turned to mockery, and then, through one act of compassion, to respect. The grand dining room of the luxurious five-star restaurant shimmered beneath crystal chandeliers. Laughter rose and fell like music, polished silverware clinked softly, and the notes of a live piano floated through the air. Around the room, wealth spoke in every detail. Men in perfectly tailored suits leaned back with confidence. Women in gowns glittering with diamonds lifted glasses of champagne, their movements as precise as their polished smiles. But in the middle of this display of elegance, one woman sat quietly, apart from the noise. She wore a simple dark kimono-style dress, elegant, dignified, but modest compared to the excess around her. Her silver hair was neatly pinned, her lined face reflecting not just age, but years of wisdom and experience. A small pendant rested at her chest and her hand trembled slightly as she held it. She was no ordinary guest. Everyone in the restaurant knew her name before she even spoke. Whispers rippled through the room. That's the Japanese businesswoman who built an empire in Tokyo. She's a millionaire. She's here on investment matters. People admired her success from afar, but when the waiter placed a menu before her, admiration slowly shifted into something else. Her eyes scanned the English words, pausing in confusion. She tried to order, but the phrases came broken, her accent heavy. The waiter leaned in, speaking louder, repeating the questions. She faltered, her face tightening as she shook her head gently. Around her, smirks appeared. Guests exchanged looks, some whispering behind napkins. Even the staff struggled, awkwardly pointing at items, failing to help. And just like that, a woman admired for her fortune was left humiliated, silenced by a language barrier. Beneath her calm composure, her eyes betrayed something deeper, loneliness. At the edge of the room, Emily, a young waitress, noticed. She wasn't one of the polished servers who attended to VIPs. Her uniform was plain, her ponytail a little messy from the rush. She spent most nights carrying trays, clearing glasses, invisible in the shadows of wealth. But as she watched the woman struggle, something stirred inside her. Emily remembered her grandmother, Japanese, proud and kind, who had never mastered English, even after decades in America. Emily had spent much of her childhood listening, translating, making sure her grandmother's voice was heard when others grew impatient. It had always felt like a small, hidden part of herself. But now, standing in that opulent dining room, Emily realized it might matter more than ever. She hesitated. It wasn't her table. Her manager would surely scold her. But compassion outweighed caution. Gathering courage, she walked slowly toward the woman's table. Diners paused mid-conversation, curious as this young waitress, plain among the elegant, bent slightly and spoke softly in Japanese. The change was immediate. The woman froze, eyes widening. For a long moment she seemed unable to breathe, and then relief flooded her face. Tears shimmered in her eyes as her lips parted into the first genuine smile of the night. Words poured from her, graceful and fluent as if a dam had broken. Emily answered gently, bridging the gap that no one else in the room could. The restaurant fell into silence. Guests who had mocked now leaned forward in awe. The millionaire, who moments earlier sat isolated and humiliated, was laughing softly, her dignity restored by the kindness of one young waitress. Emily translated her meal preferences, reassured her, and stayed close throughout the evening. With each exchange, the weight lifted, and the lonely woman became herself again. By the end of the night, she reached across the table, clasping Emily's hand firmly. Tears slipped down her cheeks as she whispered words of gratitude only Emily could understand. Weeks later, Emily received a letter at the restaurant. Inside was a handwritten note in Japanese and an elegant invitation. The woman asked her to attend a cultural foundation event in New York, not as a server, but as an honored guest. Alongside it was a scholarship. She had learned that Emily was studying languages but struggling to afford tuition. She wanted to sponsor her, to ensure the voice that had reached her in her moment of need would go on to bridge worlds. Emily cried as she read the letter. What she thought was a small act of kindness had changed her life forever. Years later, Emily stood proudly as a professional translator, traveling across countries, connecting people, cultures, and hearts. She often thought back to that night, in the glittering restaurant, where a wealthy woman discovered that money could not protect her from loneliness, and where kindness proved more powerful than riches, because in the end, it is not what we own that matters most. It is the love we share, the barriers we break, and the simple humanity that reminds us we are never truly alone. The restaurant was a palace of glass and light, its chandeliers raining gold across polished tables. Wealth moved easily through the air, men in silk ties discussing investments, women in gowns glittering like constellations. A pianist played in the corner, his notes almost drowned by the rise and fall of laughter and clinking glasses. At a quiet table near the window, a woman sat alone. She was elegant in a kimono-style dress, her silver hair carefully pinned. Her presence carried weight. Everyone in the room knew her reputation. A self-made millionaire from Japan, a business icon who had conquered global markets. Yet now, surrounded by voices she could not join, she seemed fragile, even small. The waiter handed her a menu. Her eyes traced the English words, lips moving silently as she tried to form them. When she spoke, her sentences broke apart, her accent heavy. The waiter leaned closer, repeating questions louder as if volume might build a bridge. It didn't. Whispers began to stir among the diners. Admiration faded to judgment. A few guests chuckled softly, some shook their heads. How could a woman with so much money look so powerless? Even the staff shifted in frustration, pointing to the menu, pressing for an answer. And there she sat, her dignity tested in a way that money could not shield. Her hands rested on the table, steady but tense, her eyes dimming as isolation wrapped around her like a shadow. For all her power, she was voiceless here. At the edge of the dining room, Emily watched. A young waitress, barely noticed among the glittering staff, her uniform plain and her hair pulled into a simple ponytail. She was clearing glasses when she noticed the woman's struggle. Something stirred deep within her, memories of her Japanese grandmother, who had once lived in this same silence, struggling with English in grocery stores and on buses, shrinking. Beneath the impatience of strangers, Emily hesitated. It wasn't her table. Managers hated when staff broke rules, and she risked reprimand, maybe worse. But as she looked at the woman, so respected, so accomplished, yet stripped of her dignity by a barrier of words, her choice became clear. She approached quietly, knelt slightly by the table, and spoke a simple phrase in Japanese. The effect was immediate. The woman froze. Then her eyes widened, her breath caught, and in an instant the mask of composure cracked. Relief and emotion spilled across her face, and tears shimmered at the corners of her eyes. She smiled, an expression. So raw, so grateful, it silenced the entire room. Words poured from her in graceful Japanese, her voice trembling with the joy of being understood. Emily answered gently, each response a thread-weaving connection. She translated her order, reassured her, and stayed by her side through the meal. The laughter of guests softened, judgment turned to awe. Where moments ago they had seen humiliation, now they witnessed respect being restored by nothing more than a young waitress's kindness. By the end of the evening, the woman reached for Emily's hand. Her grip was firm, her eyes wet with unspoken gratitude. She whispered words of thanks in Japanese, words meant only for Emily, words that said, "You gave me back my dignity when I had lost it." Weeks later, Emily received an envelope at the restaurant. Inside was a letter written in careful Japanese script. The woman invited her to a cultural event in New York, not as staff, but as a guest of honor. Enclosed was also a scholarship offer, covering Emily's tuition. She had learned of Emily's studies in languages, and wanted to support the future of someone whose compassion had spoken louder than wealth. Emily wept as she read. She never expected her small act of courage to echo so far. Years later, Emily stood at international conferences, her voice carrying across languages, her translations building bridges between worlds. She often remembered that night, the glittering restaurant, the lonely woman, the silence broken not by wealth but by kindness. Because sometimes the smallest act, a word in the right language, a gesture at the right time, has the power to restore dignity, earn respect, and change lives forever.